The wind was wild that evening, howling through the trees and rattling the old windows of the farmhouse that stood alone by the highway. Snow was falling thick, covering the ground in a white blanket that kept growing by the minute. The small town nearby had gone quiet hours ago. Stores were closed, roads were empty, and even the radio had gone silent when the power started flickering on and off. Inside that old farmhouse, an elderly woman sat in her living room, wrapped in a knitted shawl, sipping tea, and listening to the storm's angry voice. Her name was Martha, a woman of 78 who had lived in that house for most of her life. She was small, gentle in her ways, with silver hair tied in a loose bun and hands that always seemed busy with something. Knitting, cooking, or caring for the stray cats that often wandered up to her porch. Martha was known around town as the lady who never turned anyone away. Over the years, she had offered food to delivery drivers caught in the rain, tea to travelers who got lost, and warm coats to children who forgot theirs at school. But that night, as she sat near the old fireplace, she had no idea her kindness was about to be tested in a way she had never imagined. The power went out just after 7. Martha sighed, stood up slowly, and reached for the flashlight on the shelf. She moved carefully around the house, checking windows, making sure her old cat Whiskers was safe and warm near the fire. The sound of the wind outside was deafening. Every so often, she thought she could hear faint noises beneath it, a distant rumble, maybe thunder, or the sound of something moving along the road. Around midnight, the rumble grew louder. Martha frowned. It wasn't thunder. It was steady, mechanical, like engines. She pulled back her curtain and squinted into the darkness. Through the blowing snow, she saw dim lights moving slowly along the road, a line of them flickering like fireflies in the storm. She gasped softly when she realized what they were. Motorcycles. She couldn't believe it. Who would be out riding in a storm like this? The bikes looked heavy, the kind made for long rides, not for icy roads. There were maybe a dozen, maybe more, struggling through the drifts. Their headlights glowed through the snow, but they were slowing down one by one until the noise faded into silence. Martha's heart beat faster. The road outside was dangerous. If they stopped there, they could freeze. She stood at her door for a moment, uncertain. Common sense told her to stay inside, lock the door, and wait it out. But something in her heart wouldn't let her. She grabbed her heavy coat, pulled on her boots, and opened the door. The cold hit her face like a slap. She could barely see through the snow, but she stepped out onto the porch and called out into the storm. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" she shouted, her voice trembling in the wind. For a moment, there was no answer. Then from the white blur of snow, a deep voice called back, muffled but clear enough to reach her. "Ma'am, we're stuck. The road's blocked." She could just make out figures moving toward her, big shapes wearing thick leather jackets, pushing their bikes through the snow. The sight made her nervous. These men were strangers, rough-looking, with long hair, tattoos, and faces red from the cold. But they were shivering, soaked, and clearly exhausted. Martha took a step forward. "You can't stay out there," she called. "Come inside before you freeze solid." The men hesitated. One of them shouted back, "Are you sure, ma'am?" "We don't want to bother you. You're no bother. Come in, all of you," she said firmly, waving them toward her porch. The men looked at each other, surprised. Then, one by one, they started moving toward the light of her doorway. Snow fell from their jackets as they stepped inside, filling her small entryway with the smell of cold air and wet leather. There were 15 of them in total, all looking out of place in the cozy little house. They stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. "Take off those boots before you track in snow," Martha said, her voice gentle but steady. "There's a rug by the fire. Sit down, warm up." They did as she said. Some crouched near the fire, holding out their hands to the flames. Others leaned their helmets against the wall. Their faces were tired, their clothes soaked. Martha could see how cold they were, and without thinking twice, she went straight to the kitchen. She filled a big pot with soup and put it on the stove. The smell of onions and broth soon filled the air. One of the men, a tall one with a beard, followed her into the kitchen. "You really don't have to do this, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but polite. "We're used to rough nights." Martha smiled without looking up. "Well, I'm not used to letting people go hungry. Sit down and rest." He chuckled softly and nodded, going back to the others. The group talked quietly among themselves. Their voices were deep, filled with gratitude but also confusion at the kindness they were being shown. One of them found a broom and started sweeping the snow from the floor. Another went outside and stacked the firewood near the door. They didn't have to be asked. They just did it. When Martha brought them bowls of soup, they thanked her one by one. Some even stood up to help serve the others. Whiskers, her cat, appeared from under the couch, curious about the strangers. One of the bikers, a big man with a scar across his cheek, bent down and gently scratched the cat behind the ears. Whiskers purred loudly and everyone laughed. The storm outside kept raging, but inside the farmhouse it was warm and filled with quiet conversation. The men told stories of their travels, of long rides through deserts, of campfires by the ocean, of fixing engines by flashlight on lonely roads. Martha listened with wide eyes. She told them about her late husband, who had once been a truck driver and loved motorcycles too. When she spoke of him, her voice softened, and for a moment the room went still. One of the bikers nodded respectfully. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," Martha replied. "He always said, 'People who travel the road see the real world, the good, the bad, and everything in between.'" He wasn't wrong, the biker said quietly. As the night went on, they shared laughter and stories. Martha brought out blankets and pillows, setting them on the floor for her unexpected guests. Some of the men fell asleep near the fire, others on the couch, their heavy boots lined up neatly by the wall. Before going to bed herself, Martha looked around the room and smiled. These men, who might have frightened her at first glance, now looked like tired sons resting after a long journey. When she woke the next morning, the storm had calmed. The world outside was bright and white, the air crisp and still. She found the bikers already awake, moving quietly around the house. They had shoveled her driveway, cleared her porch, and were chopping wood out back. She watched them from the window, amazed. "You boys didn't have to do all that," she said when they came inside for coffee. The man with the beard smiled. "Least we could do, ma'am." "You saved our skins last night." Martha shook her head. "I just did what anyone should do." He looked around at his friends, then back at her. "You'd be surprised how few people would open their doors to us." She looked at them carefully. 15 men in black jackets, faces weathered by wind and road, and said softly, "Maybe people just need to see past the leather." They all laughed, and for a moment, the farmhouse felt like the heart of the world, a warm place where kindness mattered more than appearances. By noon, the roads were open again. The bikers thanked her again and again before heading out, promising they'd stop by if they ever passed through town again. Martha waved from her porch until the last of the engines disappeared down the road. Then she went back inside, made herself a fresh cup of tea, and smiled to herself. She didn't know it yet, but that night of kindness would not be forgotten. Something special had begun. A bond that would bring the rumble of engines back to her doorstep far sooner than she imagined. The morning after the storm was calm and clear, but the snow lay thick and heavy across the land. The trees sparkled under the soft sunlight, and the world seemed strangely quiet, as if holding its breath after a long night of chaos. Inside the farmhouse, Martha stirred awake to the smell of coffee and the sound of laughter. For a moment, she forgot what had happened the night before, but when she opened her eyes and saw the leather jackets hanging on the wall, it all came rushing back. She smiled as she sat up, listening to the low hum of voices coming from the kitchen. When she shuffled in, still in her warm slippers, she found a few of the bikers busy at the stove. One of them was flipping pancakes, another was washing dishes in the sink, and another was trying to fix the broken leg of one of her kitchen chairs. It looked almost like a small family breakfast, though it was made up of the most unlikely mix of people. "Morning, ma'am," said the tall one with the beard as he noticed her. "Hope you don't mind, we figured we'd make breakfast to thank you." Martha chuckled softly. "Well, isn't that something? I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me." The bearded man grinned. "We're not great cooks, but we do all right when we've got a stove and some coffee." Martha sat at the table while they finished up. She watched them move around her small kitchen carefully, making sure not to break anything, speaking to each other with surprising gentleness. When they brought her a plate piled with pancakes and eggs, she thanked them with a warm smile. They all sat down together, eating and chatting as if they had known each other for years. Some of the men shared stories about the road, the kind of stories only travelers tell. One spoke about crossing the desert at night under a sky full of stars. Another told how they once helped a stranded family fix their car in the middle of nowhere. Martha listened closely, fascinated by the world they described. She had spent most of her life in that little town, and though she loved it, she often wondered what lay beyond the horizon. "You boys see a lot of things," she said, sipping her coffee. "Must be lonely sometimes." "It can be," one of them admitted. "But there's freedom in it, too. Out there it's just you, the road, and the wind." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds peaceful in a strange kind of way." After breakfast, the men began getting ready to leave. The storm had cleared, and it was time for them to continue their journey. They carried their helmets outside and brushed the snow off their motorcycles, which were half buried from the night before. Martha stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, watching them prepare. The air was so cold it made her breath look like smoke. The bearded man walked up to her. "We'll never forget what you did for us, ma'am. You really saved us last night." Martha shook her head. "You give me too much credit. You just needed a warm place. That's all," he smiled. "Maybe, but you didn't have to open that door. Most people wouldn't have." She looked at him kindly. "My husband used to say, kindness is only real when it costs you something. I figure a bit of soup and firewood isn't much to give when it means keeping someone safe." The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of respect. "Your husband must have been a good man." "He was," she said softly. "He believed everyone deserves a chance to be seen for who they are, not what they look like." The man nodded and reached out his hand. "You remind me of my own grandma. She used to say something just like that." Martha shook his hand, and for a moment they stood there quietly. Then he turned and called out to the others, telling them to start their engines. The motorcycles roared to life, breaking the stillness of the snowy morning. Martha waved as they rode off down the road one after another, until the last sound of the engines faded into the distance. When the silence returned, the house felt a little emptier. Martha went back inside, tidied up, and sat by the fire with Whiskers curled in her lap. The warmth of the morning lingered in her thoughts. She couldn't stop smiling. Something about the men's visit had reminded her that goodness still existed in unexpected places. As the day went on, she kept thinking about them. She wondered if they had made it to their destination safely. She thought of their laughter, their politeness, and how they had worked together like brothers. The image of all those big men crowded in her little living room made her chuckle every time she pictured it. Later that afternoon, Martha bundled up and went outside to feed the birds. The world was bright and quiet again. The snow crunched under her boots and the air smelled clean. She stood for a while just watching the sunlight glint off the snowdrifts. Everything seemed peaceful, but deep down she felt something stirring, a sense that her small act of kindness might have meant more than she realized. That night, she sat by the fire again, thinking of her late husband. His old photo still hung above the mantel, showing him standing proudly beside his truck. She spoke softly to the picture, as she often did when she felt lonely. "You'd have liked them," she said. "They were good men, rough around the edges maybe, but kind where it matters." As the flames danced in the fireplace, Martha felt a warmth in her heart that wasn't just from the fire. The storm had been frightening, but it had brought something beautiful with it: connection. For one night, her home had been filled with life again. The next morning, she woke early, made herself a cup of tea, and looked out the window. The snow-covered world looked calm and still. She thought about the road and how far the bikers must have gone by now. Maybe they were already halfway across the state. Maybe they were sitting at a diner somewhere, talking about the old lady who gave them shelter. The thought made her smile. She spent the day doing her usual chores, feeding the animals, baking bread, and writing a letter to her niece. Everything felt normal again, but the memory of those 15 men stayed with her. It wasn't fear she remembered. It was gratitude. They had treated her home with respect, shared stories, and even repaired small things around the house before leaving. The kindness had gone both ways. That evening, as the sun went down behind the snowy hills, Martha went outside once more to bring in firewood. The sky was painted with orange and pink, and the air was so still she could hear her own heartbeat. She stood for a long moment, taking it all in. Then she turned back toward the house, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Just as she reached the porch, she thought she heard something faint in the distance, a low, steady rumble. She paused, listening. It could have been the wind or maybe a truck on the highway, but for a second she could have sworn it sounded like motorcycles. She smiled and shook her head. "You're imagining things, old girl," she said to herself. Still, she couldn't help feeling a little spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't seen the last of them. She went back inside, set her tea on the table, and sat down with Whiskers in her lap once again. The fire flickered softly and the house felt peaceful. Martha didn't know what the next day would bring, but she felt grateful for the night she had shared with those travelers. It reminded her that even when the world outside feels cold and uncertain, a little warmth and kindness can change everything. Outside, the snow glowed under the moonlight. The storm had passed, but its story was only beginning. Somewhere far down the road, the sound of engines echoed faintly in the distance, carrying with them the memory of one small farmhouse and the woman who had opened its door when no one else would. The sun rose slow and soft the next morning, casting golden light across the snow-covered fields. The air was still cold, but the storm had passed for good. Martha woke to the gentle creak of her old farmhouse settling in the quiet. She took her time getting out of bed, her joints stiff but her heart light. The memories of the past 2 nights were still fresh in her mind. The laughter, the smell of soup, the sound of engines fading into the distance. It almost felt like a dream. She made herself a cup of tea and stood by the window. Outside, everything looked peaceful again. Birds were already pecking at the seeds she had scattered the day before. The snow glistened under the morning sun like tiny diamonds. She smiled softly, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Life was quiet again, but a part of her missed the company. As she took a sip of tea, she thought about the bikers. She wondered where they were now. Maybe they had reached their destination. Maybe they were already planning their next journey. She hoped they were safe. They had come into her life so unexpectedly, yet somehow it felt as if they had left a lasting mark on her heart. The day passed peacefully. Martha spent most of it tidying the house. There were still a few signs of her guests. Boot marks on the floor, an empty coffee mug on the counter, a pile of firewood they had chopped stacked neatly by the door. She smiled every time she noticed something they had done. They had treated her home with such care, like it was their own. That thought warmed her more than the fire did. In the afternoon, she went into town to get a few supplies. The streets were still half covered in snow, but people were out shoveling and talking about the storm. When she stepped into the small grocery store, the shopkeeper, a friendly man she had known for years, smiled and said, "Martha, you made it through the blizzard, I see." "I did," she said with a laugh, "though it got mighty cold out at my place for a while." "Heard the road by your farm was closed off for a bit," he said. "Didn't get any visitors, did you?" Martha hesitated, thinking how strange it might sound if she told him 15 bikers had spent the night at her house. But she smiled and said simply, "A few travelers got stuck in the storm. I gave them shelter." The man looked surprised. "Well, that sounds like you, Martha. Always helping someone." "They were kind men," she said. "Polite too," he chuckled. "You must have made an impression on them. Folks remember that kind of kindness." Martha smiled but said nothing more. She bought her groceries and headed home. As she drove back along the quiet highway, the snowbanks tall on either side, she thought about what the shopkeeper said. Maybe it was true. Maybe they would remember her. Still, she had no idea how true that would turn out to be. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the world outside turned a deep pink and gold. Martha sat by the fire again, Whiskers in her lap, the warmth of the flames flickering on her face. The house felt calm, but her mind was restless. Every now and then she thought she heard something, a faint sound like distant thunder. She would pause, listen, then shake her head. "Just the wind," she murmured to herself. But this time, it wasn't the wind. Around dusk, as she was washing her teacup, the sound grew louder, a low rumble, steady and strong, rolling in from the distance. Her heart began to race. She dried her hands and went to the window. The noise grew closer, echoing off the hills. Then she saw it, a glint of chrome, a flash of light, then another and another. She stepped out onto her porch, and what she saw made her breath catch. Over the rise, the road was filled with motorcycles. Not just a few, but dozens. Their headlights cut through the early evening light, one after another, until it looked like a river of shining steel and sound flowing toward her house. Martha stood frozen, her shawl fluttering in the breeze, unsure what to think. They slowed as they approached her gate, engines growling softly as they came to a stop in neat rows along the road. There must have been 100 of them, maybe more. The noise alone shook the ground beneath her feet. For a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. Then she saw familiar faces, among them the men from the storm. The tall one with the beard smiled and waved. Martha's hand went to her chest as she gasped softly. They had come back. The man climbed off his bike and walked toward her, snow crunching under his boots. He wasn't alone. A few others followed, carrying bags and boxes. Martha met them halfway down the walkway. "What in the world is all this?" she asked, trying to hide her amazement. The bearded man grinned. "Told you we wouldn't forget you, ma'am." "You surely didn't have to bring an army with you," she said, half laughing, half teary. "We wanted to come back and thank you properly," he said. "Word got around about what you did. So the rest of the crew wanted to meet you too." She looked past him at the endless row of bikes lined up along the snowy road. The sight was almost unreal. Men in leather jackets, their patches shining in the fading light, standing respectfully near her gate as if it were holy ground. Some carried firewood, others carried groceries, and one even had a new generator strapped to the back of his bike. "Good heavens," she whispered. "You didn't have to do all that." "We wanted to," he said simply. "You opened your door when no one else would. That kind of thing doesn't happen much anymore." Her eyes grew misty. "I just did what anyone should do." "That's the thing," he replied. "Most people don't." They carried the boxes up to her porch. Fresh food, blankets, even a new kettle. One of them fixed the loose step she'd been meaning to repair for months. Another shoveled the snow from her path without a word. The scene was like something out of a movie. 100 bikers, all quietly working around her little farmhouse, smiling and laughing like old friends. When they were done, the bearded man reached into one of the boxes and pulled out something wrapped in paper. He handed it to her gently. "This is from all of us." Martha unfolded the paper, and inside was a black leather jacket. On the back, embroidered in white thread, were the words "Honorary Angel." She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, you didn't need to do this. We wanted you to have it," he said. "You're family now." For a long moment, Martha couldn't speak. She pressed the jacket to her chest and smiled through her tears. "You boys are something else," she said softly. They stayed a while longer, talking and laughing as the night settled in. Some sat on the porch steps, others leaned against their bikes, their breath rising in the cold air. They told her how their group had been touched by her kindness, how it reminded them of the people who had shown them compassion when they needed it most. Martha listened, humbled and happy. When it was finally time for them to leave, they promised to come back again. The bearded man shook her hand once more. "You ever need anything, ma'am, you call us. We'll be here before the kettle boils." She laughed softly. "I'll remember that." As the bikes started their engines, the roar filled the valley again. Martha stood on her porch, the jacket draped over her shoulders, watching them ride away under the starry sky. The rumble of their departure faded slowly, leaving behind a silence filled with wonder and warmth. When she finally went back inside, she hung the jacket by the door and touched it gently, as if it were made of gold. She sat by the fire with Whiskers, still smiling. The storm had brought strangers to her door, but kindness had made them family. From that day on, whenever she heard the distant sound of engines rolling down the highway, she would smile and whisper, "My boys are passing through again." And sometimes, just sometimes, a few bikes would slow down and turn up her driveway, their headlights glowing in the dusk, to make sure the kind old lady who once saved them was still doing just fine. Winter slowly turned into spring, and the snow began to melt away, leaving behind muddy roads and green shoots pushing up from the cold ground. Martha's farmhouse, once surrounded by thick drifts of snow, now sat in a field of soft, damp earth. The air was still cold in the mornings, but the world was waking up again. Birds were singing, and the wind no longer carried the harsh bite of winter. For Martha, life had gone back to its usual quiet rhythm, though something inside her felt forever changed. It had been a few months since that unforgettable day when the line of motorcycles filled the road outside her house. Sometimes, when she sat by her window, she still pictured the sight: engines gleaming, boots crunching in the snow, and a sea of grateful faces smiling at her. The jacket they had given her hung proudly by the door. Every time she passed it, she ran her hand along the soft leather, feeling the stitching of the words "Honorary Angel." It was more than just a jacket. It was a symbol of kindness shared between strangers who had become friends. Life in her small town carried on as usual. Martha went to the local market once a week, helped with the church bake sale, and spent her afternoons tending her garden. Neighbors often stopped by to chat, asking again about the story that had become something of a legend in town. "Is it true, Martha?" they would say. "Did 100 bikers really come to your house?" She would just smile, nod, and say they did, and they were the most polite guests I ever had. But as much as people loved the story, Martha didn't share every detail. Some things she felt belonged just to her. The warmth of that night, the laughter, the moment when strangers turned into something more like family. Those were memories she kept close to her heart. One morning in early spring, Martha was sitting on her porch drinking tea when she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It wasn't loud or fast, just a steady hum that grew closer. She shaded her eyes against the sun and saw a single motorcycle coming down the road. Her heart lifted. She didn't recognize the rider at first, but when he stopped at her gate and pulled off his helmet, she smiled. It was the tall man with the beard. "Morning, ma'am," he called, his breath visible in the cool air. "Well, look who the wind blew in," Martha said, smiling as she stood up. "You're a long way from the city," he grinned. "Told you we'd check in on you." He parked his bike and walked up the path carrying a brown paper bag. "Brought you something," he said. "Just a little thank you from the guys." Martha took the bag and peeked inside. It was filled with fresh coffee beans, homemade preserves, and a box of tea. "You boys are going to spoil me," she said with a chuckle. He laughed. "You earned it." They sat on the porch for a while, talking and catching up. He told her about their rides, how the group had done a charity event for a children's hospital, and how they still talked about the night the storm brought them to a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Martha listened, proud and touched. After a while, the man looked out over the fields and said quietly, "You know, ma'am, that night changed a lot of us. We meet a lot of people on the road, but no one ever treated us like you did. You didn't look at us and see trouble. You saw people who needed help." Martha smiled. "Well, maybe that's all any of us ever need. A little help now and then," he nodded. "You're right about that." Before he left, he told her that their group had made it a tradition now. "Every winter we ride together in honor of that night," he said. "We call it the Snowstorm Run. Starts with a meal and a prayer for folks who help strangers when they don't have to." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "That's a fine thing to do," she said softly. When he rode away, she watched him disappear down the road, his bike kicking up a trail of dust behind him. She stood there for a long while, her heart full. She hadn't realized her simple act of kindness had spread so far. Weeks passed and the world turned greener. Martha planted flowers in her garden, baked pies for the neighbors, and spent more evenings sitting on her porch watching the sun go down. But she couldn't help thinking about those men and the lives they led, the open roads, the long journeys, the way they always seemed to find family wherever they went. One late afternoon, just as the light was fading, she got another surprise. This time it wasn't a motorcycle that pulled into her driveway. It was a truck. When the door opened, out stepped a woman holding a small child by the hand. Martha didn't recognize her at first, but the woman smiled and said, "You must be Martha. The boys told me all about you." It turned out she was the wife of one of the bikers from that stormy night. She had come with her son to bring Martha a basket of goods, a thank you gift, she said, from all their families. Inside were baked treats, fruit, and even a framed photo. Martha gasped when she saw it. The picture showed her standing on her porch months earlier, surrounded by the bikers, all smiling. Someone must have taken it that morning when the sun came up after the storm. Tears filled her eyes as she traced the frame with her finger. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." The woman stayed for tea, and they talked for hours about life, family, and how kindness seemed to travel further than anyone could imagine. When the woman left, Martha stood by the window long after the truck disappeared, still smiling. She placed the framed photo on the mantel beside her husband's picture. It looked right at home there. As the weeks rolled by, Martha started getting letters, handwritten ones from some of the bikers. They wrote from different towns and states, telling her about their travels and the people they met. Some enclosed small souvenirs, a postcard, a pressed flower, a photo from the road. Each one made her heart feel a little lighter. She kept them all in a box by her chair, reading them on quiet evenings. By summer, her farmhouse had become something of a landmark for travelers. Occasionally, bikers she had never met would stop by saying, "You're the lady who helped our friends that winter, aren't you?" Martha would invite them in for tea, and they would sit by the fire or on the porch talking for hours. Her little home had become a place of rest for many who passed through. Sometimes she thought about how strange life was, that a single storm, something so harsh and dangerous, had brought so much warmth into her world. She often said to herself, kindness has a way of circling back, and she believed it with all her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange, Martha sat on her porch wearing the leather jacket the bikers had given her. The air was warm and the sound of crickets filled the fields. She closed her eyes and listened. Far off in the distance, she thought she heard the faint, familiar sound of engines rumbling on the highway. She smiled to herself, whispering, "Ride safe, boys." The days ahead were peaceful. Martha never grew tired of telling her story. Not because it made her feel important, but because it reminded her of something she believed deeply. That goodness could come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. You just had to open your door when the knock came. And every winter, when the snow began to fall again, she would glance at the jacket by her door and the photo on her mantel, and know that somewhere out there, a group of riders was thinking of her too, keeping her memory alive with every mile they traveled. Her house had once been just a quiet old farmhouse on the edge of town. But now it was something more, a place where kindness lived and where the road always led back home. It had been almost a year since that winter night when Martha had taken in the stranded bikers. The memory of that snowstorm still lived bright in her mind, like a candle that refused to go out. The town folk still spoke about it from time to time, telling newcomers how one old lady had opened her door to a group of rough-looking riders and ended up finding a family in the most unexpected way. Martha never tired of hearing it, though she always blushed and waved it off, saying, "I only did what anyone would do." But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have done the same. Maybe kindness came easier to her because she had known what loneliness felt like. Now the leaves were turning golden, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn. The fields around her farmhouse shimmered with dew each morning, and the sky stretched clear and blue for miles. Martha was sitting on her porch one cool afternoon, knitting a scarf for a neighbor's child when she heard it again, the sound she had come to know so well. A low, deep rumble in the distance. Her heart gave a little jump. She put down her knitting and stood up, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Down the road, she could see them coming. The familiar line of motorcycles, their headlights flickering like fireflies. Her heart warmed instantly. It was the same group, though maybe not all of them, rolling down the country road toward her house. She smiled so wide it made her cheeks hurt. When they pulled into her yard, the noise filled the quiet evening air. One by one, the riders parked their bikes neatly by the fence. They climbed off, their jackets dusted with the road, their boots muddy, but their faces full of smiles. Martha stood at the top of her porch steps, her hands clasped together like a mother waiting for her children to come home. "Ma Jenkins," one of them called out cheerfully, using the nickname they had given her that winter.
"You thought we forgot about you?"
She laughed softly. "Never crossed my mind. I was just wondering when you'd come back around." They all came up the steps one by one, giving her gentle hugs and warm greetings. One man handed her a bouquet of wildflowers. "Picked these on the way," he said shyly. "Figured you might like 'em better than roses." "They're perfect," Martha said, her eyes twinkling. They all went inside, filling her little farmhouse with the sound of laughter and stories. She had baked a pie that morning, apple and cinnamon, and though she hadn't known why, now it seemed like fate. She cut slices for everyone, served hot tea and coffee, and listened as they caught her up on all they had been doing. Some had new jobs, others had moved, and one proudly showed her a photo of his baby girl. As night settled in, the group began to talk about how they had been planning this trip for months. "We couldn't let the year go by without seeing you," one said. "That night changed us, Ma. You changed us." Martha looked down at her cup of tea, her eyes soft. "I didn't change you," she said. "You just let your kindness show, that's all." The men nodded quietly. They knew she meant it. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound simple, even the things that felt heavy. After dinner, a few of the riders went outside to stack firewood she hadn't gotten around to chopping. Another fixed the squeaky hinge on her gate. They didn't ask, they just did it the way family does. Martha watched from the window, her heart full of warmth. The night was cool and still, and the laughter that drifted through the air sounded like music. Later, when the stars came out, they sat on the porch together. The fields were bathed in silver light, and the only sound was the occasional croak of a frog near the stream. One of the riders began to tell a story about another storm they had been caught in, down south. He laughed about how they'd wished they'd had another Ma Jenkins there to take them in. Everyone laughed, including Martha. As the night went on, Martha brought out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of her husband, her children when they were young, and now the photo the bikers had given her the previous spring. She passed it around and they looked at it with respect, as though they knew how precious it was. "He would have liked you, boys," Martha said softly, looking at the picture of her husband. "He always said the best folks you'll ever meet are the ones the world doesn't expect much from." The riders nodded quietly. It was clear they understood exactly what she meant. Before they went to bed that night, some in sleeping bags, others on the floor, one of them said, "We were talking earlier. Ma, we're thinking about fixing up that old barn of yours. Turn it into a place we can all meet. Maybe bring the families next time. What do you think?" Martha looked out at the barn, its roof a little bent from years of storms, and smiled. "That sounds like a fine idea," she said. "That old place could use some life again." The next morning, the sun came up golden and bright. Dew sparkled on the grass like tiny diamonds. The riders got up early, made coffee, and started working on the barn before she could even make breakfast. Martha stood at the window, shaking her head in disbelief and joy. The sound of hammers and laughter filled the air. By noon, the barn looked better than it had in decades. When the work was done, they all gathered inside for lunch. Martha had made sandwiches, and someone from town had dropped off fresh cider after hearing who was visiting. The group sat on hay bales, eating and talking. One of the bikers stood up and said, "Ma, we were thinking, we want to make this our spot. Every year we'll come back here for a weekend. Help you with whatever you need and spend time together. You good with that?" Martha felt her throat tighten. "I'd be honored," she said softly. The men clapped and cheered, raising their cups of cider in a toast. It wasn't a fancy moment, but it was real, filled with warmth and gratitude. That afternoon, when it was time for them to leave, Martha stood on the porch again, waving as they rode away. The engines rumbled, the sound echoing across the fields. Dust rose behind them, catching the sunlight. She stood there until the road was empty, then walked back inside. Her house felt quiet again, but not lonely. The laughter still lingered in the air, like the smell of fresh pie cooling on the counter. As she sat down by the window, Martha picked up the jacket they had given her and ran her fingers over the stitching. She thought about how much had changed since that snowstorm. What began as a single act of kindness had turned into something far bigger, a connection that stretched across miles and hearts. That evening, a letter arrived. It was from one of the bikers who hadn't made it on this trip. Inside was a short note. "Ma, I couldn't be there this time, but I'll see you next winter. Don't forget about us. You're our angel." Martha smiled, tears filling her eyes. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with the others. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air grew cooler and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. Martha sat quietly, sipping her tea, thinking about the road and the people on it. Somewhere out there, her friends were riding beneath the same sky, heading toward their next stop, and she knew that wherever life took them, they'd always find their way back. Before going to bed, Martha stepped out onto the porch one last time. The night was still, the stars bright above. She closed her eyes and whispered into the dark, "Ride safe, my boys." Then she smiled and went inside, her heart warm and peaceful. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of open roads, blue skies, and the sound of engines fading into the horizon. And in her dream, she wasn't alone. She was right there among them, wind in her hair, laughter in her heart, riding toward another day filled with kindness and light.